Well, but that's not punishment. So you have all kind of opportunities to do important things, like what we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't do it, that's just cowardice. I mean, it's different if you think about, say, dissidents in a totalitarian state. Okay, there you have problems. You can end up in the gulag, you can be put in jail. If you're an American dependency, like El Salvador, you get your brains blown out. That's what we do to dissidents. But in the United States, like the Jesuit intellectuals in 1989. But if you're in the United States, there's essentially no penalties, unless you really get involved in serious resistance activities, as I've done, and so on. But then you choose it. You don't have to do that. Well, I think that's a pretty good definition of a kind of cowardice, moral cowardice. And even beyond it is the fact that the values are internalized.
Mm-hmm.
So you can perceive yourself as adversarial, courageous, challenging power, and so on, but on grounds that are so narrow that it just supports violence and terror. Take, say, the Iraq War. Obama is highly praised for being a principled critic of the Iraq War from early on. What did he say? He said it's a strategic blunder. I mean, you could have read that in Pravda in 1985, when the Communist Party spokesmen were saying, it was stupid to get into Afghanistan, strategic blunder. In fact, you could have heard it from the Nazi general staff after Stalingrad. Trying to fight a two-front war was a strategic blunder. Should have knocked out England first. I mean, is that principled criticism? Well, when that's presented as principled criticism, it's worse than flag waving, much worse, because it gives a sort of superficial impression of criticism. And what it's actually saying is, okay, here are the bounds. You can go this far and not 1 millimeter farther. And this far means everything we did is sort of well-intentioned, and but we make mistakes. Now, if you go through a long period, say the Vietnam War, it went on for a long time. You get to the end of the Vietnam War in 1975. You read the retrospectives. They're quite interesting. The most critical commentator that I know in the media is probably Anthony Lewis of the New York Times, way off on the dissident end. He wrote a review of what happened. He said that we began with blundering efforts to do good. Blundering because it didn't work. Efforts to do good because it's a tautology. If the United States did it, it was efforts to do good. So we began with blundering efforts to do good, but by 1969, it was clear that it's a disaster, and we cannot achieve our marvelous aims, bringing democracy and so on, except at a cost too great to ourselves. That's the retrospective. I mean, you destroy 3 countries, you kill millions of people, and we know the reasons why it was done. It's not efforts to do good. I won't go into them. But in fact, the U.S. sort of won its war aims. But the only thing that's wrong is it was going to cost us too much. That's at the extreme dissident end. I mean, of course, there are others, but within the mainstream. Now, what does that tell you? It's much more dangerous than when some, Glenn Beck or someone says, we should go in there and kill them all. Much more dangerous. Because this sets the bounds of criticism.
Yeah.
Now, when people, there's all this talk about the liberal media, and people on the left refute it and so on. I agree with it. I think the media tend to be liberal. And I think they're much more dangerous for that reason, because their liberalism is setting the limits of possible criticism. So look how bold we are. We even said it was a mistake, strategic blunder. Well, that means you can't go beyond that. If you go beyond that, you're just kind of off on Mars or something. But and that technique, I wouldn't say technique because it's not planned. It's just like instinctive. It's a acculturation. You're incorporated into an intellectual culture which doesn't see anything funny about this. And that means if anybody wants to go beyond, let's say your students, they must be crazy or Marxists or whatever the current word of abuse is, terrorists or something. And it's astonishing the way it works. I mean, take the original sins of this society. I mean, the first one was extermination of the indigenous population. Extermination is the word that was used, for example, by John Quincy Adams, and First Secretary of War, and so on. So they knew what they were doing. They were exterminating the indigenous population, many millions of people, conquering half of Mexico, and so on. Occasionally you get a reference to it. I've just seen 2 references in 2 of the world's leading intellectual journals, kind of leftish, left liberal intellectual journals. One is the New York Review of Books in the United States. The other is the London Review of Books in London. They're kind of sister publications, sort of. And they're about as far as you can go in criticism and be anywhere within the range of respectability. Well, there was an article about 8 or 9 months ago in the New York Review, a review of a book of American history, a major historian, Edmund Morgan, and the reviewer was a kind of a noted liberal political analyst, says that he was surprised at how much he learned from this book. He learned that when Columbus arrived, the hemisphere was empty. There were only about 1 million people, kind of hunter-gatherers scattered around, no society, no culture. He was off by maybe 80 or 90 million.
Slight factor.
They had advanced civilizations, not different from the Europeans, except in the means of warfare. And of course, they're not all gone. And here they're mostly gone. North America, it's in the territory of the United States by the year 1900, I think it was down to a couple 100,000.
Yeah.
It's increased since. Not a letter, not a comment. The London Review of Books, I think it's in the current issue, has an article about the conflict over the Armenian genocide. And they quote the senator who was pushing it, the resolution, and the article says, well, he started out ritually, just to show his good faith, by referring to the American mistreatment of the native population. Yeah, it's like talking about the Nazi mistreatment of the Jews. We wouldn't accept that. But this is fine. That's if we carried out the word genocide isn't strong enough to describe it, but whatever you want to describe it as, didn't happen. And we can deny it with impunity and with a sense of integrity and courage and we're critical intellectuals and so on. I mean, pretty much the same is true of the second original sin, slavery. I mean, it's assumed, what you learn in school is that slavery ended with the Emancipation Proclamation. It didn't. There was a period of about 10 years, Reconstruction, when slavery formally ended. Then there was a compact between North and South in 1877, and something was instituted which is probably worse than slavery, namely criminalization of the black population. So if a black man is standing on a street corner, he can be arrested for vagrancy. Maybe the fine is $25, but by the time he tries to pay off the corrupt judge and a bunch of lawyers, he's in jail for life. If he looks the wrong way at a white woman, he can be arrested for attempted rape. I mean, they essentially criminalized the population. And that's a very significant part of U.S. economic development. That's a large part of the core of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, there were the criminalized workforce was sent back to be slave labor. They worked in the cotton fields and chain gangs. They worked in the mines. U.S. Steel employed them and so on. It's a big piece of American industrial history. It lasted until the Second World War. In the Second World War, they needed what's called free labor for the war effort. So that system ended. And the Second World War, there were jobs. You work in war industry. The Second World War, thanks to substantial government intervention, obviously, laid the basis for the economic boom of the next couple of decades.